Now Marion Rezai talks to the great Suzanne Ciani.
Hello, how are you?
Great. How are you? Nice
I'm
to
well,
see
thanks.
you. Yeah.
It's really an honour to be able to interview you and welcome you to TUSK TV. So thank you for agreeing to this interview. Back in the 1970s, you collaborated with Harold Paris on The Voices of Packaged Souls, and it's really an incredible sound sculpture. Can you tell us a little bit about how you created the sounds in that, please?
Yes, I mean, that was a very early project for me. It was technically my very first album. We made an LP back then. And at that time, I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, getting my master's degree in music composition, traditional composition. But I also had the good fortune to go to Stanford University to study computer music with the father of computer music, Max Matthews. So there was a summer course with Max and John Chowning, the father of FM synthesis. So I was really in the, the cradle of this technology, and it was fascinating because you couldn't make sounds immediately. You had to design them on paper, and then the machine would punch cards based on what you did. And then the next day, you would come back and get a big tape of the audio if it worked. So it was a very remote kind of system for understanding music, and it served me my whole life. That wasn't the only way I did the sounds, because the other important person that I met at that time was Don Buchla, who lived next door to Harold Paris. So they both had these big lofts where they worked, big industrial buildings. And Harold took me over to meet Don Buchla, and the rest is history, because, I just went crazy. I fell in love with those walls of analog modules, and Don Buchla just happened to be um, what I call the Leonardo da Vinci of modular electronic music instruments. So I was really in the right place at the right time. Another technique that I used on that album was what they called music concrete, which was really the popular way of organizing sound before analog modulars came along. So you could record, and then you could make tape loops. You could cut and splice the tape to change the sound. You could slow it down. You could speed it up, and all those operations for sound control were typical of the prior generation, when the tape recorder came in, during World War II. And so there were a lot of uh, electronic musicians who worked in music concrete. So this album is really a combination of all those techniques. I worked at a radio station in Berkeley. They gave me the studio from midnight till 7 a.m., and I put it together there. It was a lot of fun. It was also, I have to say, because Harold, what he did is he gave me these ideas for sounds: the sound of a nose peeling, the sound of an old man loving, the sound of a lighted window. So these were like poetic suggestions. And that was really the beginning of my understanding that I could create sounds in a poetic way, inspired by, making a sound that maybe doesn't really, a thing that doesn't really have a sound. Come here, kitty. Come here. I have an old kitty. She was wild, and now she just craves affection all the time.
Oh.
So
What's the
yeah.
kitty's name?
Mouse.
Oh, mouse! That's amazing. That's the best thing I've ever heard.
I'm kind of hopeful that she will, in fact, catch some mice. Although I hate to see them caught. Come here. She's very big. There. Okay. Oh.
Hello, mouse. Oh, that's amazing.
She couldn't be touched for the longest time. For years, she was just so terrified. And now she wants to be touched all the time.
Oh.
She's big and fat. Okay, so here we are.
She's beautiful.
Well, I don't know. Only a mother could love this. She had to have her big teeth removed. So she's maybe not. And I think she's old. I have no idea how old she is. Okay.
She's gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. You want her? You want to go to England? You can put you on a plane this afternoon.
Anytime.
Okay.
So the process of making sounds and these punch cards, I mean that must have taken some incredible patience. I mean, what was it like for you creatively and like as a composer to like work with that?
Yeah, it was very remote. It was like drawing without touching the paper or something, It was a remote process. And what it was, though, it translated into a deep understanding of sound, because what we were doing was going to the very basics. On a basic level, all sound can be analyzed into sine waves.
Yeah.
Just that is a phenomenal idea, that it can all be broken down, any sound, into a bunch of sine waves, the sine wave being the simplest waveform, and that doesn't exist in nature. So it doesn't exist in nature. So the fact that we had these computers at the time, and they were huge, they filled a whole room. This was before personal computers. And it's just fascinating. So I took to it. Plus, Max, what an inspiration. He was the kindest, most brilliant man. He didn't end up, but he worked with Boulez in Paris at IRCAM and did a lot of invention. He invented the baton that moved, that could conduct an orchestra. And later, that type of technology was used in gaming, where you interact. So he designed interfaces the same way Don Buchla did. These were both pioneer, inventor, designers. So I was just lucky. I didn't like getting up at 4 a.m. to drive to Stanford. I had an accomplice. So I had a friend who shared the driving with me. I couldn't have done it alone. So I'm grateful for that. It's always nice to have a buddy,
4 a.m, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Take shifts.
Right.
Well, talking of computers and computer games, for Record Store Day this year, Finders Keepers Records re-released the Xenon Pinball.
Xenon.
You've had quite a few different works that have been re-released, and I wanted to ask you about this because the Xenon Pinball machine is, it's at cult status, and your voice is all over, and it's wondrous. It's absolutely amazing. And can you tell us a little bit about how you made and how you worked with your voice?
Well, I worked backwards with that project because in the end, the sound had to be contained within the chips that the machine had. And sound chips were just starting then. It was really amazing. Texas Instruments had one, Motorola had one, and this one was special in that it had two sections to it. It had a generator, so it could make certain waves, square wave, sawtooth, sine wave. And then it had a little tiny sampling capability. So I just looked at, the end configuration, what could be held within this chip, and then I designed for that. So it was, I was lucky because by that time in my studio in New York, I'd been very successful in advertising. And so I invested in a lot of equipment. One of the machines was called a New England digital synclavier. It cost $200,000. And you can't even imagine how expensive technology was back then. 50 megabytes of RAM was $50,000, or 10 megabytes was $50,000. So we were in a different zone back then. That was why, because I was in love with music technology, that was why I had to make a lot of money just to afford it. And so it went hand in hand, because the projects that I worked on were also helped me to advance, the technology as well. So anyway, I did work backwards. I sampled my voice. I also, as you know, obviously, if you listen to the machine, I modified my voice. I had something called a voice box, which was a grouping of outboard mods, the vocoder, digital delays, compressors, all kinds of things that allowed me to use my voice in new ways. So there are lots of grunts.
Enter Xenon. Welcome to Xenon.
My goal in this, and I had never designed for a pinball game, and I had this, because I was, I wanted to be on the frontier of things. A lot of the things I did, there were no rule books about how to do them, and I loved that freedom. So even if I didn't know how to do something, I always said, yes, I'll do it. And then I'd figure out how to do it. And that meant that I went to an arcade in Manhattan, and I watched people. I started at the bottom, what is this game? What do people do when they're playing pinball? And I went to the very grunt level. I noticed that when people were playing, that they were making sounds and reacting and interplaying, with the machine. And so I thought, well, what if the machine played back at you? So it was really this kind of engagement. And plus, I designed the sound so that it would create a composition. All the little modules work together so that the player actually could create the composition. It was a lot of fun. And the kids loved it, because I had this, well, I wanted to make the machine sexy.
It
I don't
worked.
know why. It worked.
It's definitely very sexy.
In those days, or even anytime, it had a reputation for being this cold thing, this machine-like thing. And my goal of making it sensual was just to make it warm and friendly, and so that you could connect to it, as opposed to being afraid of it, which a lot of people are.
You also worked with Atari a little bit later on. Was that was that because you were inspired and you?
Here's the thing, at that period of time, historically, these chips and early computer control was beginning. So you found chips in dishwashers, chips in elevators, chips in games. And because I had the music house that was high tech, these companies would come to me to do their sound design because I know how to do it. And so Atari was an obvious, client for us because Ciani Musica, which was the name of my company then, we specialized. We were the first ones really in Manhattan to specialize in designing sounds and tracks for advertising. Was a wonderful business. It was an anonymous business. So I did all these sounds and all this work, but nobody knew, my name was never on it. So it's only today through Andy, really, who's connecting these things to me. He's releasing things that I did commercially that were making that connection. I did work as an artist in advertising, so I wasn't just doing work. I was really engaged in it, and really wanted to express my personal, ideas in that medium. So Atari was a lot of fun because, one of the things we did in the soundtracks was recreating the simple sounds that were in their machines and then using them musically.
It feels like was a natural progression from working with adverts and sound design into full film scores. Because in the 80s, you scored The Incredible Shrinking Woman, and that Galaxy Glue song is just iconic.
Galaxy Glue, Galaxy Glue. What would we do without Galaxy Glue?
How did you get involved in that film and in that scene?
Well, one thing connected to another. So one of the advertising executives at a big agency had gone to Hollywood and worked at Paramount. When he was there, he was head of, I think, music, and one of the music editors, now I can't remember his name, but Hunter Murtaugh was the executive, and he came back to New York, and he was in charge of a campaign for Lincoln Mercury. They had big budgets back then. And one of the things he wanted to do is bring Hollywood teams into Manhattan, into New York, to, make Lincoln Mercury a filmic, to use the highest level. So John Barry, who scored Out of Africa, was doing a Lincoln Mercury commercial, and so was I. So I also did electronics on John's commercial. But the link was the music editor. In commercials, we didn't use music editors. That was a film job because there was such, yardage of music, so much music, somebody had to be there to put it into place and to aid the composer in mapping out, what the music would be or where it would be. So he saw the way I worked with picture, because I had a technique back then where I could marry sound, a composition, to a visual perfectly. I would have hundreds and hundreds of counts in a little tiny commercial, but you wouldn't feel it, stretching or pulling and trying to meet the edits. But I felt that commercials, they were short, and the viewer needed every support system to actually see and hear. And I felt that I could, in designing the sound, allow the viewer to see better because I would support the visual. So Kenny, now I remember his name, Kenny, he was so impressed by this. He went back to Hollywood and he said, "You've got to hire this girl. She really knows how to work with picture." And the other lucky thing was that Verna Fields was head of production at Universal. She had edited Jaws. Jaws was a big hit. there weren't many openings for women in the film industry. Editing was one. You got locked in a room for months and they let the women do that. But Verna, because that was such a hit, she got promoted to head of production. So I had a woman in power. And then, of course, Lily Tomlin, woman. And so that was really the power that got me hired. I was shocked, when the phone rang and they said, the guy said, "This is Brendan Cahill from Universal Pictures." He had a British accent. Um, I, I hung the phone up. I thought it was a joke. So, and then it rang again. And oh my God, okay, all right, okay. It was so unexpected. I mean, these things didn't happen. But I have to tell you that in my current research, what I found out, we've had a lot of discussion just all over the world now about women, because we're at the peak of another women's consciousness movement. And what we realize is that we don't know our own history because we didn't have visibility. So the New York Times, for instance, is starting to do, redo, what is it, when you die, obituaries. Okay, they're redoing obituaries of women that passed away that were not even recognized. And we have a history that we're just discovering. And I actually discovered a woman who in the 1940s was hired to do a Hollywood film. Her name was Elizabeth Firestone. I don't know anything about her except that I managed to track down her film. And I think that the big opening for women, one of the big openings in the past, was World War II. So when the men were off at war, the women could expand into, jobs and work that hadn't been available to them before. And I think Elizabeth is one of these examples. She worked during the wartime in the 40s. I think we need to do a lot more research to begin to discover women's history. There was a famous woman in the 40s, Daphne Oram. Do you
Yes.
know her? Because she's British. Okay, well, I hadn't ever heard of her. And then I played at Royal Albert Hall and they premiered an orchestral piece of hers over 70 years after it was written. So that's how long it took for her to get a performance. And, we assume too easily that women just, I don't know, busy having babies, I don't know, but that they weren't producing creative work, when in fact they were, but they just didn't get any visibility. I think, we know now that music technology was attractive to women because it gave them independence. I can sit here and play with this machine and create a final product, and I don't need, the machinery of the business or the music business that maybe doesn't want me, or what I do. I was never a pop artist, even though I worked in commercials and I worked with a lot of very high profile musicians who worked on lots of records. And, Luther Vandross would sing my jingles. But I was doing a very personal music as an artist. And I wanted to do it in a very personal way. And I was able to do that because I could self-produce it. I couldn't get a record deal for what I did.
Yes, Seven Waves. There's a story behind that, isn't there? In Seven Waves, you found it difficult to get it released in the US. Is that right? So it first came out in Japan.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Seven Waves was a long journey. So, that was my first studio album. Well, now we know about Voices of Packaged Souls, but it wasn't on my radar screen because, it was an early thing that I did in my, in a tiny studio. But the Seven Waves was a major production. I worked at the biggest studios in New York with the highest level of equipment. I had NECAM mixing, and it was very expensive. It took years to do it. Um, and when I finally got some of the pieces done, I started to shop for a deal. And I had known Tangerine Dream in Europe, and I thought, well, maybe it's easier to get a deal there. And I went there all through Europe, and I couldn't get a deal. I couldn't get a deal in the United States. And then, and that time, Japan was maybe the third largest music market. And so I had this notion to go to Japan. I went to Japan and I got a deal. And then that deal, once I had the LP, that helped me get a deal in the United States. And that launched, my visibility
Yeah.
in that world. Yeah.
I can only imagine you must have felt some frustration rather because, you've done all this incredible work and you've got at that point already an incredible career, and you've got so much clout and you know what you're doing. You've pioneered in fields, and then you felt that you couldn't get that record deal in at home. But I suppose, at least now, from what I understand, it's very cool to be part of to be very successful in Japan. It's something that a lot of artists want,
Really?
So,
Oh, good.
so you kind of went for something very difficult and did really well with it. I know a lot of people who would love to be able to brag that, and that includes me, and I can't. So that's amazing. So in the 90s, there was a shift in your composition, and you were writing more music that's called New Age, and you had, by this point in the 90s, 5 nominations for Grammys, which is just incredible. How does your compositional process for acoustic instruments differ from that with the electronic?
Well, I was brought up as a classical pianist, and I had studied classical music. So it was in my root system, the idea of notes on paper and realizing a composition that way. In my early Buchla music, that was a different vocabulary. It was done improvisatorial, but with compositional elements. And, it was a completely different approach to composition and music. It was voltage control. It was designing shapes of voltages that then you applied to the various parameters of sound, and you created a spatial moving sound. So it was always quadraphonic. I was very ununderstood in those early days, and it was lonely because I would play my Buchla, and in those days people didn't understand even where the sound was coming from. It was so new that it was just like something people couldn't even see. So when it finally came time for me to be in a position to actually record my album, my first album, Seven Waves, I think what I did was I combined the two worlds. So I took my electronic world and I combined it with my classical world. From my classical world, I took melody and harmony. From my electronic world, I took sound and movement and colors, and so that album was really and the next album. But what happened over the course of the albums is they gradually became more and more acoustic until in 1994 I did a purely acoustic album with orchestra and piano. You know, who knows whether that goal was, I've had such a long career and a long life that you see that there's no straight line anyway. Things go. I love the image of a wave to describe just about everything, because nothing is linear. It's all kind of energy systems that grow, recede, and grow and recede. So it's just one more of those waves that I've come back to electronic music now. I'm not doing the studio recordings right now. For the last 5 years, I've just been playing this machine live again, you know.
And are you enjoying live performance?
Well, I really was. I mean,
Apart from when the world paused.
it was a magic time because, this is a very fragile instrument. And I never expected, I was very kind of open about it. It's like, if the machine arrives and doesn't break, I will perform. If it breaks, I will not perform. And, I had this opening for failure the whole time, because that's, when you're in technology, you experience failure. It's like a switch. It's either off or on, And so I did have some close calls, especially in England, where the baggage handlers are very, very rough. But everything always worked. All the concerts worked. And I went all over the world several times. So now with COVID and having stopped for a year, over a year actually, I'm out of that momentum of just getting on planes every week to a different country, and I don't know, I've done a lot of online concerts now, but the tricky thing is that I play in quad. So it has to be spatial, it has to move. And that has been difficult to translate over the internet.
Yeah.
So there is some, things are starting to come up to speed. Apple has just announced their interest in spatial sound, and it is changing. So maybe, if the technology for shared music comes up a little bit, I could continue to do it from home.
In other interviews, you've mentioned that you've often been more interested in the process of making sound with modular than the resulting sounds, and maybe that they've come second. Has your relationship with sound evolved in that way? And the reason I ask you this is because I play with turntables, and I understand the process of looking at things with a very technical idea in your mind, or wanting to experiment with that, and then perhaps sometimes the sound comes secondary. Or how does that work for you? Or do you approach composition with something very technical in mind?
I've always thought of myself as a composer, so from the time I was a little kid, and for me that had to do with notes. So I do have a world of, notes that I work with. But through electronics, of course, I expanded that into just pure sound. Uh, but what I'm not interested in is the note that is a sound, because that, I think, that arose with the keyboard. When the keyboard was attached to the so-called synthesizer, people thought that, it was going to be able to make all these interesting sounds that then you could play on the keyboard. And that was really hostile to the whole understanding of what these machines wanted to do. So keyboard was completely not okay. So you can still use notes though, because we have sequencers and we have other ways of voltage controlling sound. So pitches are still important to me in combination with sounds. But as I say, I'm not getting a beautiful sound and saying, oh, let's listen to that sound. Because the voltages are in constant motion, right? One of the tricks of performing live with these instruments is to keep it moving, because machines can get stuck. And when they get stuck, it's like, oh my God, okay, it starts to repeat. And really part of the process of just interacting with this machine to perform is to keep it moving, to keep it interesting, to have it grow organically, right? To keep interacting on your toes there. And it's a joy to do that, because you've got this interactive feedback system. You do something, you hear it, it inspires something, and you keep going.
So through all of the amazing albums and all of the instruments and ensembles that you've worked with throughout your career, are there any particular favorite instruments or any particular favorite sounds?
I go back and forth. So I don't have any steady state of whatever it is. I guess the one album that I've always loved is Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg Variations, the early one, the first one from the 50s. And I can listen to that forever. That's home for me. That's the album they say, which one would you take with you if you could take one? It would be that one. And I can listen to it over and over and over. And I always hear it differently. I think we haven't paid enough attention to the listening experience, that there is no, there's no there. We are creating that experience every single time. And every single time it's different. I'm in a film group now, and people will say, oh, I've already seen that film. And I'm saying, well, see it again. It will be different. Your engagement with it it's alive. We are a living part of the expression of any art form. It doesn't exist without our intake and our experience, that we resonate, with it. So, you can listen to, we learned that in classical music. You don't say, oh, I've already heard Beethoven's Fifth. It's like, yeah, you know. I've already read that book. I'm rereading War and Peace now for like the umpteenth time, and I just love it. Every time it's different.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about working online and your work with Quadraphonic, and you've got some ambisonic stuff coming out online. And I was wondering, what do you think the future holds for electronic music, or is there something you would like to see more of in the future of electronic music?
Well, one of my areas of interest is the design of the machines, because now we have a revolution going on, a renaissance in this interest in analog modular.
Yeah.
And there are thousands of modules now, and it's really amazing. But I don't see, I'm promoting Don Buchla because in his lifetime of dedication to designing these machines, I mean, he came up with ideas that still haven't been expressed outside of his instrument. And one of them is this spatial controller. So in analog, you can use control voltages to move the sound. And that's fundamental. Every analog system should have the capability. And the speakers now, in the old days, speakers were gargantuan. You needed special amps and all that. Now everything's built in. You can get these little speakers. There's no excuse anymore for not having, 4 speakers for your setup. You can go directly from the output directly into the speaker, that you don't even need a lot of stuff in between. So I would like to see embracing of spatial control. I think it's fundamental in electronic music. It is something we can control very effectively. I'd also like to see voltage control of effects, the effects that enhance the sound. We're all used to effects now. I bet. Do you use them in your DJ sets? Do you have outboard effects?
Yeah, a couple of things. I dabble.
You dabble, okay. Well, in the old days, we had a voltage controlled reverb. It was a spring reverb, but you could move it. You could make the sound close or far away just on a dime, and we can't do that today. We don't have that. So there are a lot of areas that were fundamental 50 years ago that we need to not miss again this time. So, in ways, this instrument starts to look like something from the old world, all these, but I think we have a new appreciation for hands-on control. I think there's a wonderful aspect to software since it's more democratic. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get it, but that doesn't mean that we don't need the physical. I think we all desire the physical, and that's what I'm interested in, is the onward going of the design of these instruments. There's so much to look into, graphic interfaces, but things that allow us to interact and control the sound. I don't even know what that's going to look like in the future. I don't know, but I think we've done so many iterations of this already. It's like there's nothing new almost. We've had dancers controlling sound and fluorescent pads controlling sound and lasers controlling sound, and all of those, interactions. But it's a fascinating field because there's no there. Technology is fluid, and it has so many, every synth, every analog modular is different. You choose what modules you want. So where do we look for definition? We don't look at a piano and see 88 keys and so many black and white keys and say, hey, we figured it out. This is a fluid design language, and there's no definition, right? But there is interactive ability. The interface is really what we're looking at.
Thank you so much for spending time with myself and with TUSK TV and our audience, and for this brilliant interview. Thank you so much. It's really
so much, Miriam. Thank you so much.
One should hold it about here most of the time. I've tied the volume up and I'm about a foot away from this, and it's jiggling around frantically. I'm not going over the mark, going into the red as it were. This looks pretty logical.